They denied a black CEO his first-class seat. 30 minutes later, the entire airline was begging for mercy. It started the way these things often do, quietly, almost too quietly. On Atlantic Airways Flight 447, passengers were still boarding when the shift happened. A subtle shift in tone, posture, power. At 12:43 p.m., Marcus James stepped into the first-class cabin wearing a white hoodie, tailored black slacks, and wireless headphones. He moved with calm precision, not arrogance, not hesitation, just the quiet confidence of a man who had done this many, many times before. He placed his briefcase under the seat, adjusted his tray table, and sat in Seat 2 Alpha. He was sipping a glass of sparkling water and reviewing quarterly slides on his tablet when the flight attendant stopped. Her name was Holly Pearson, blonde hair in a tight bun, navy blue lipstick, crisp uniform like something out of a recruitment poster. She paused when she saw him, smile faltering just a second too long. "Excuse me, sir," she said, leaning in as if he were lost. "Can I see your boarding pass?" Marcus looked up, polite but unreadable. He reached into his coat pocket and handed it to her without a word. She took it, glanced, didn't even scan it. Then, a furrowed brow, a squint, a faint frown. "This is for first class." "Yes," Marcus said, still calm. "That's where we are, right?" She didn't laugh, didn't nod, just blinked. Then she muttered, "One moment," and turned sharply down the aisle, walking fast, back toward the front of the plane. Her heels clacked like a clock counting down to something no one saw coming. The woman in Seat 2 Bravo, white, late 30s, gray blazer, looked over. "That was weird," she whispered. "She didn't check mine." Marcus gave a slight shrug. It happens. But he was watching the reflection in the window. He saw Holly reach the flight deck and gesture toward the captain. He saw the look exchanged, quiet, coded. And then the captain stood up. Captain Douglas Hartman was in his early 40s, tall, square jaw, and had that clipped military way of walking that made people either feel safe or nervous. He walked the aisle straight toward Marcus without a smile. "Sir," he said flatly, "we're going to need to clear up a seat discrepancy. Can you come with me, please?" Marcus didn't move. "No discrepancy. I'm in 2 Alpha. You'll need to come with me." "No, thank you." A pause. A breath. "I'm the captain of this aircraft. If you don't comply, I will have you removed." Passengers had started to look up now. Phones were out, casually at first, like tourists filming a takeoff. A man in row 5 tapped record. Another whispered, "What's going on?" A woman muttered, "He's not doing anything." Marcus calmly handed the captain the same boarding pass. "Would you like to scan it?" The captain didn't take it. Instead, he nodded to another flight attendant. She whispered something into her earpiece. Marcus turned slightly in his seat, pulled up his phone, and opened a PDF, a digital receipt with a barcode, itinerary, and one bold line at the top. Seat 2A, first class, Atlantic Elite member. He tilted the screen toward them. "I paid for this seat. I've flown this airline 97 times. I've held elite status for 5 years. You are welcome to verify." But they didn't. Instead, Holly folded her arms and said, "We've had fraud before." The implication landed like a slap. "Fraud," Marcus repeated. "You people are clever." Those 3 words, not loud, not screamed, just spoken, in a voice that had said them before, in private, in locker rooms, behind closed doors. But this time, a dozen cameras were recording. Someone in row 3 said, "Whoa," and then a voice in the back, "Is this happening right now?" The captain shifted, aware now of the eyes. "Sir, I'm going to give you one more chance." Marcus slowly stood, not angry, not defeated, but deliberate. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a black card, titanium, weighty, engraved. He held it up between 2 fingers. "This is a Chen Industries Platinum Executive card," he said. "I'm Marcus James, CEO. We own 22% of this airline." Silence. Then, "Wait, what?" from someone in economy. Holly's lips parted, but no words came. The captain blinked. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." Marcus lowered the card. "But go ahead. Remove me. I insist. Let's see how the board handles that." And that's when everything changed. You could feel it, like the moment before a storm. The kind of moment people talk about for years after, the moment someone stood up, calmly, and flipped the entire balance of power. But Marcus wasn't done. Not even close. Because what he said next would shake the foundation of the airline and force them to make a choice right there at 30,000 feet. The cabin was no longer silent. Tension vibrated in the recycled air like an invisible current, stronger than the hum of the jet engines waiting to spool. It began the moment Marcus James lifted the titanium card and announced who he was, and it grew in every heartbeat that followed. Around him, passengers who had been heads down in travel routines suddenly became witnesses, phones tilting upward, red record icons glowing like tiny warning lights. Their screens framed the captain's stiff posture, the flight attendant's flushed face, and Marcus standing his ground in seat 2A. A woman halfway down the aisle whispered into her camera that the airline had just tried to evict a black man from first class. Within seconds, her clip was airborne, bouncing from one feed to another, the kind of story the internet devours because it is simple, visual, and burning with injustice. By the time the captain's earpiece crackled with a frantic gate supervisor, more than 100,000 strangers had already seen Marcus's calm refusal spread across their phones. Inside the aircraft, nothing felt calm. The captain, still clutching a clipboard he no longer cared about, faced Marcus again, voice quieter now. He said they would sort this out, but his eyes flicked toward the recording passengers and the bright red tally of unread messages stacking on his watch. Holly, the flight attendant who had started the confrontation, stood behind him breathing shallowly, her earlier certainty evaporating in real time. Marcus remained unshaken, the picture of contained velocity. He scrolled on his tablet with deliberate care, pulling up a document titled Incident File, Flight 447. It already contained video links, passenger seat numbers, timestamps, and a drafted statement addressed to Atlantic Airways Media Relations. He added one more note under crew response. Captain refuses to acknowledge documented proof provided 3 separate times. Then he closed the file and opened his email client. A murmur rippled down the rows as if everyone could sense he was about to do something irreversible. One man in economy called out that they were with him. Another passenger, older, said this moment reminded her of Montgomery buses, and suddenly people were speaking names like Rosa Parks out loud in first class, an unthinkable comparison only minutes earlier. Each sentence fed the cameras. Each camera fed the story. Meanwhile, outside the plane, Atlantic Airways headquarters felt the first tremor. A junior social media analyst ran to her supervisor's desk saying a flight-related clip was exploding on the platform, something about a shareholder CEO. Supervisors escalated to directors, directors to VPs, and soon the chief communications officer was sprinting down a hallway clutching a phone she dared not silence. Back in the cabin, the captain's radio hissed. The gate supervisor's voice was sharp with fear. Corporate had eyes on the feed. They wanted immediate de-escalation, no forced removal, no confrontation. The captain swallowed, but pride pinned his feet. He tried once more, softer now, asking Marcus to step into the galley just to clarify paperwork. Marcus replied that clarification was unnecessary when the facts were already clear to anyone willing to look, including the millions currently doing so on their lunch breaks. The woman seated in 2B, who had watched Holly breeze past her unchecked ticket, finally rose. Her voice trembled, but carried through the hush. She stated plainly that Marcus had been singled out, that she had witnessed it, and that she would testify to it under oath if required. Her words detonated the last veneer of airline authority. Holly's shoulders slumped, the captain's jaw tightened, and passengers began speaking to each other openly about lawsuits and civil rights while their cameras stayed fixed on the scene. Marcus pressed send. The email shot into the ether carrying video attachments, a concise timeline of discriminatory actions, and a firm demand for immediate structural accountability. Its recipients were the entire board of Atlantic Airways, every C-suite executive, and a blind-copied list of influential journalists whose inboxes would light up before the wheels even left the ground. Inside the cockpit corridor, A junior flight attendant whispered to Holly that corporate wanted everyone to stand down, that the company lawyers were already involved, that removal was no longer an option. Holly looked at Marcus only once more. What she saw was a man who had turned their narrow cabin into the stage of a global courtroom where every viewer became a juror and every second of delay deepened the airline's guilt. Marcus slid back into his seat, buckled in, and put his headphones around his neck instead of over his ears. He wanted to hear the rustle of panic, the quiet apologies, the sudden politeness that always arrives too late. The captain retreated to the cockpit to phone someone higher, someone who might still save his career. But outside that door, the verdict of public opinion was already forming, and the evidence traveled faster than any jet engine could propel them. As the aircraft finally pushed back from the gate, passengers whispered that they had never seen an airline crumble so quickly. Marcus, staring out the window at ground crews waving traffic batons, tapped his phone once more. This time, he opened a secure chat with his legal team. A single line appeared from his lead counsel. "Board saw the email. They're panicking." Marcus allowed himself one long breath. The fight was no longer confined to seat numbers or boarding passes. It had leapt into boardrooms, newsrooms, and living rooms across the country. And the file he had just sent, the file growing by the minute with every passenger clip and crew whisper, was about to land in those boardrooms with the force of a black box recorder pulled from a wreck. Impossible to ignore, impossible to spin. What those executives did next would decide not only the fate of a flight crew, but the direction of an entire airline. Because Marcus had just proven that the fastest way to break altitude is to shine a light on what was never meant to be seen. It arrived at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. The subject line didn't scream, didn't threaten. It was clinical, quiet. Just 6 words. Incident on Flight 447. Immediate action required. But the name in the from field snapped every spine straight in Atlantic Airways Executive Suite. Marcus James, CEO, Chen Industries. For a moment, there was stillness in the glass offices 30 floors above Manhattan. Then, like the slow onset of turbulence, the pressure changed. Phones buzzed. Email alerts chimed. And then came the first voice, sharp, tight, from Atlantic's general counsel. "Everyone, look at this, now." The email wasn't long, but it didn't have to be. In the body, a direct, formal statement describing the racial profiling incident that had unfolded in real time aboard one of their own jets, implicating both flight crew and command-level failure. Attached were 7 files: live passenger video clips, screenshots of social media reactions, a copy of Marcus's boarding pass, and a timeline built with surgical precision. The final line was the part no one dared read aloud. If corrective action is not initiated within 2 hours, this documentation will be released to public channels without redaction. For the first time in years, the boardroom went silent. Douglas Vance, CEO of Atlantic, stood by the floor-to-ceiling window staring down at the city, not moving. He didn't say a word, but everyone could see it. His grip tightening around a ceramic mug. The clench of his jaw. He had underestimated Marcus. Badly. By now, the story was everywhere. The video had made it to every platform, from cable news to trending subreddits. The clip of Marcus calmly stating his ownership stake, on camera, in first class, was playing on loop. Commentators were already dissecting Atlantic's response, or lack of one. Reporters were calling. Lawyers were circling. Shareholders were asking questions they'd never asked before. But Marcus hadn't done any press. He didn't need to. He let the footage speak, let the silence from the airline speak even louder. In that silence, the damage took root. Inside the boardroom, a debate raged. One executive said they should issue a blanket apology. Another insisted they wait it out, hope the outrage moved on by the weekend. But the damage wasn't moving. It was deepening. Then someone said it. This wasn't random. He planned this. Not the incident itself, that had been as spontaneous and ugly as 1,000 others. But what came after? The speed, the clarity, the documents, the pressure points. That was not the work of someone reacting. It was the work of someone ready. Because Marcus hadn't just sent them a PR problem. He had sent them a case, with receipts, with timestamps, with policy citations. He didn't ask for an apology, he asked for a reckoning. Back on Flight 447, Marcus knew exactly what was happening behind those glass walls. He had seen this dance before, the clumsy shuffle of corporate panic when real consequences arrive. He looked out the window. The plane was still grounded, now delayed almost an hour. A few passengers were starting to ask why, but most already knew. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't weather. It was them. It was the aftermath of judgment misfired and power misused. Marcus took out his phone again and began replying to emails. He was direct, professional, unwavering. One message to his legal team. One to the head of his communications firm. One to a former federal compliance officer he'd quietly kept in his network for moments like this. He wasn't playing defense. He was laying groundwork. A flight attendant, younger, anxious, possibly new, approached him quietly. Her name tag said Amber. She looked around, unsure if she'd be reprimanded for what she was about to do. "I just wanted to say," she whispered, "I saw what happened, and I'm sorry. That shouldn't have happened to you." Marcus nodded. "Thank you." She hesitated, then said, "They trained us to look for behavior outside the norm in first class. That's the exact phrase. They never explained what norm means, but we all understood." Marcus's eyes didn't leave hers. "I know," he said. "I understood the moment she asked for my ticket and not the woman next to me." Amber glanced behind her, lowered her voice. "There's more. They've told us to document certain passengers, not officially, but informally. It's a culture." Marcus nodded once more. "You're not the only one who's told me that today." As she walked away, he opened the note on his tablet and typed a single sentence beneath a bold heading labeled training culture. Then he set it aside and waited. Not for vindication, for impact. Across the country, in newsrooms and conference rooms, that impact was beginning. A CNN anchor framed the event as a turning point. Not just another viral outrage, but a test of corporate integrity. Commentators debated the line between unconscious bias and systemic behavior. Former employees began sending anonymous tips, flagging past incidents that looked eerily familiar. And in the shadows of Atlantic's sleek public image, a long-forgotten audit began resurfacing. An internal report from 4 years ago that warned of disproportionate targeting of Black and brown passengers. The audit was never published. Its author was quietly dismissed. Now it was evidence. As the engines finally began to hum and the plane rolled back from the gate, Marcus sat with hands folded, head high, knowing the real movement wasn't in the air. It was in the cracks forming beneath the surface of a company, long convinced it could fly above consequences. The board had a choice now: respond honestly, or stall, deny, and brace for what came next. And Marcus, quiet, calm, and dangerous in his precision, already knew which path they would take. Because he wasn't just sending emails anymore. He was pulling levers. And the next one would turn their crisis into a collapse. Some turbulence never shakes the wings or rattles the drink cart. It surges through an invisible network of phones and hearts. Marcus felt that current as Flight 447 finally clawed into the sky, banking east toward New York while the cabin lights dimmed for takeoff. The moment the seatbelt chime snapped off, his phone began to glow with a single new message. "I saw the video. It happened to me. My name is Angela Thompson. Atlantic ruined my life. If you are fighting, I am ready to stand with you." At first, the name was only a faint memory, but the face returned in a rush. A Black mother with 2 children, tears on her cheeks as uniformed agents marched her down an aisle 3 years earlier. In that clip, she kept asking permission to sit beside her young son. The airline had apologized to anyone who felt discomfort, then buried the incident in a fog of paperwork. Marcus inhaled once, slowly. He wrote back in 9 measured words, "We need to talk. My team will reach out tomorrow." But Angela's note was only the opening crack in the dam. Within minutes, the screen filled again. A retired pilot from Dallas who had logged 20 years in cockpits said he had witnessed colleagues quietly marking certain passengers out of place in first class. A former customer service agent confessed she had been trained to select random secondary screenings that never felt random. By the time the cabin crew began serving drinks, the messages outnumbered the miles they had traveled. Marcus read each line, filing names, flights, dates. The stories differed in detail, but the chorus was the same. Doubt first, dignity second, apology never. And each person, no matter their race or rank, spoke of the same chilled moment, the instant they realized the airline's smile could tighten into suspicion with no warning at all. In the boardroom skyscraper half a continent behind them, an emergency call lit up the communications channel. A junior analyst stuttered that the company feed had exploded again. This time, it was not just Marcus on screen. It was Angela, recorded through trembling hands, telling her story in real time. Her voice broke only once, when she described the look on her child's face as strangers pulled them apart. The clip shot across morning shows before sunrise, gathering more witnesses like sparks find dry grass. Atlantic attempted a quick patch, releasing a paragraph that spoke of isolated misunderstandings and renewed commitments to respect. The statement landed with a hollow thud. Viewers had already seen too much. Reporters began asking for the buried audit that had once warned of disproportionate complaints from black and brown passengers. No one at headquarters could locate the final draft, though everyone remembered the thick folder that disappeared after one short meeting. While corporate public relations staggered, Marcus connected with Angela again, this time by video from his hotel after landing. She spoke plainly, no filters, no makeup, eyes red, but unblinking. She said silence had cost her a career, a home, and years of restful sleep. Marcus listened through every sentence, then asked if she still had her original boarding pass. She nodded. She had framed it as a reminder never to assume she would be treated fairly again. Outside their private call, momentum gathered its own gravity. A phrase began circulating without hashtags, a simple three-word promise whispered in comment sections and group chats. We fly too. It was not a slogan drafted by an agency. It was a declaration, passed hand to hand, that every cabin seat belonged equally to anyone who paid for it. Overnight, the phrase appeared on poster board outside Atlantic ticket counters and in the bios of newly emboldened employees. Inside the airline, fear turned into clumsy containment. Middle managers ordered staff to avoid jokes on internal channels. Supervisors deleted old chat logs. Yet screenshots leaked anyway, revealing casual mockery of passengers flagged for wandering in premium zones. The jokes sat beside directives to assert authority early, training language that no one could explain without stammering. Marcus watched each leak like an investigator tagging evidence. He was not chasing sympathy. He was cataloging patterns. Every document, every confession became another thread in a widening net that now reached beyond Atlantic's walls. Journalists requested interviews. Lawmakers hinted at hearings. Civil rights attorneys offered pro bono support, but Marcus answered none of them yet. He was building weight, not noise, because the next move had to land with undeniable force. At dawn, 2 days later, Marcus walked the length of the Brooklyn Bridge with his counsel. The wind off the river cold enough to sharpen intent. He spoke of transformation, not punishment. The lawyer warned him reforms would threaten careers. Marcus said careers rebuilt on exclusion deserved the threat. They reached the midpoint of the bridge just as the sun edged over the skyline. Marcus stopped, pulled out his phone, and drafted a single sentence to his team. It ends at the board. He pressed send. Far uptown in the mirrored tower, executives read the latest social monitor and felt the floor tilt. Share prices slid another fraction. Institutional investors whispered about leadership risk. And Douglas Vance, staring at his own reflection in the glass, realized the storm he had dismissed as a social media squall was now a disciplined front marching straight toward him. Marcus closed his eyes against the river wind and pictured a long conference table, 9 chairs, and 1 file he would drop in the center. But before he opened the boardroom door, he needed one final piece, a testimony powerful enough to silence every easy excuse. Angela Thompson had already agreed to stand by his side. All that remained was the meeting notice. And in 24 hours, that notice would hit every executive inbox, carrying the weight of hundreds of quiet stories that would never be quiet again. By the fifth day after the incident, Marcus James had become more than a name trending on news tickers. He had become a storm that Atlantic Airways could no longer outrun. Stockholders were nervous. Executives were meeting behind closed doors. And yet, inside the airline's glass tower in Manhattan, there was one thing no one wanted to say out loud. They were afraid of what he'd do next. They didn't have to wait long. At 7:41 a.m. on a Thursday, a formal demand arrived in the inboxes of Atlantic's executive board. Marcus wasn't requesting a meeting. He was calling one. As a major shareholder, he had the legal right, and he exercised it with surgical precision. The agenda was clear. Not vague apologies or optics management. It was a challenge to the very leadership of the company. One that included a direct implication that if the board didn't act, he would. The CEO, Douglas Vance, still didn't take it seriously. He'd built his power on old money, legacy connections, and a boardroom that always looked the other way. To him, Marcus was still just a moment, loud, emotional, but temporary. A social media headline that would fade by next week. But as the clock ticked toward the emergency board session, it became clear this wasn't temporary. It was tactical, calculated, deliberate. At precisely 9:00 a.m., Marcus stepped into the boardroom. No entourage, no press. Just him, holding a slim leather portfolio and walking like a man who no longer needed permission to be in the room. Some board members looked up with stiff nods. Others didn't look at all. Douglas Vance was already seated at the head of the table, speaking with the COO in a clipped, hushed voice that stopped the moment Marcus took his seat. The CEO opened first, trying to get ahead of the narrative. He spoke about public pressure, unfortunate incidents, and the delicate nature of racial dynamics. His voice was calm, measured, the practiced tone of a man who'd handled scandals before. But Marcus didn't let it continue. He placed the portfolio on the table, opened it slowly, and looked directly at Vance. "This isn't delicate," he said. "This is deliberate, and it's documented." He pulled out a printed copy of the internal audit from 3 years ago, the one that flagged growing complaints of racial bias among crew members, the one Vance had shelved without action. He placed it in the center of the table like evidence in a courtroom. Then came the next document, a timeline of disciplinary warnings ignored, bias training postponed, and internal memos joking about optics during DEI reviews. All signed, all dated, all real. Vance tried to interrupt, but Marcus kept going. He laid out the full incident, not just from his perspective, but from the crew logs, passenger statements, and crew transcripts he'd quietly obtained. It was a pattern, not a mistake, not an isolated case, a culture. And then Marcus said the words that shifted the entire room. "If this board refuses to act, I will. If this leadership remains intact without accountability, I will take this file and every supporting document and release it to the public, names included. No redactions, no delay." Silence. Not stunned silence, strategic silence. Board members were now calculating, glancing at one another, assessing risk, watching where the wind was blowing. Finally, one of them, Ravi Narayan, a younger board member with a background in ethics compliance, leaned forward. "I've reviewed those documents," he said, "and I believe action is necessary." Another nodded. Then another. Across the table, Douglas Vance's jaw tightened. He stood slowly, bracing himself on the edge of the table. His voice was low, furious. "This is a hijack." Marcus stood too, calm, still measured. "No," he said. "This is a correction." A vote was called, not to remove the CEO, not yet, but to approve Marcus's reform package. It was the first real test of power. 6 votes in favor, 2 opposed, 1 abstained. It passed. Vance didn't speak again. He just sat there, stunned, as if watching the walls close in. Marcus collected his portfolio, offered no smile, and walked out of the room without looking back. Outside, the press was waiting. Cameras rolled, microphones pointed. The questions came fast. Do you believe the airline is racist? Will you push for the CEO's resignation? What's your next move? Marcus didn't pause. He didn't flinch. He looked directly into one of the cameras and spoke clearly. This was never about just a seat. It was about power, who's allowed to have it, and who gets questioned when they do. That's not just this airline's problem, that's America's. Then he walked past the cameras, past the noise, past the building he now partially controlled. Because this wasn't the end of the story. Marcus wasn't finished. The next phase would reach beyond Atlantic, to the regulators, to the unions, to the Department of Transportation itself. And he was ready. Because Marcus James hadn't just won a boardroom battle. He had just declared war on an industry. The thing about altitude is this. The higher you go, the clearer the patterns become. By the time Marcus James stepped into the marble corridors of Capitol Hill, the storm was no longer confined to Atlantic Airways. It had spilled across terminals, talk shows, Senate offices, and union halls. A single act of profiling, caught on camera at Gate C-14, had become the most public interrogation of commercial air travel since 9/11. But this wasn't about security. This was about trust. And Marcus had come with the evidence that trust had been broken. What began as an incident report was now a briefing packet, bound in black and gold, handed to every member of the Transportation Committee. Inside, 3 years of compiled data, sourced through whistleblowers, FOIA requests, and independent analysts Marcus had commissioned himself. It showed, in plain language and cold statistics, that black and brown passengers were disproportionately flagged, moved, questioned, and removed from flights, not based on behavior, but appearance. And it wasn't just Atlantic. It was systemic. The numbers didn't lie, but they hadn't been easy to find. The airlines didn't publicize them. The FAA didn't track them. And internal investigations, when they existed at all, almost never made it past page 4. Marcus had pulled threads through all of it. Not as a victim, not even just as a CEO, but as a man who had lived it, documented it, and refused to let it vanish into bureaucracy. When he entered the subcommittee hearing room, there were already reporters pressed to the glass. Behind the senators sat aides with laptops open, scrolling the live feed of reactions pouring in online. The air was dry, artificial, humming with anticipation. And Marcus walked to the witness table without a script. He didn't need one. His story had already been told in every airport lounge and living room across the country. He began not with outrage, but with memory. He described the moment Holly, the flight attendant, looked at him like he was a mistake in the system. The moment the captain demanded he leave the aircraft, not because he had broken a rule, but because he had broken their expectation of who belonged in first class. Then he paused and looked directly at the committee chair. "But that wasn't the first time," he said. "It's just the first time anyone filmed it." A senator from Ohio cleared his throat and tried to pivot, asked about airline training standards, diversity programs, internal review procedures. Marcus waited, then answered with numbers. Numbers the airline had never published, that the FAA had never collected. He told them what the oversight systems failed to track: who gets stopped, who gets documented, who gets believed. Another senator asked what reforms Marcus wanted to see. He didn't flinch. Transparency. Federal oversight. A mandate that all airlines log demographic data tied to passenger complaints and crew interventions. Annual audits made public. And consequences not just for employees, but for executives who let bias thrive behind policies vague enough to be deniable. The room fell still when he added, "If airlines can track what snacks I order in flight, they can track who they're profiling." Outside the hearing, the media caught every word. The clips went live before the gavel dropped. Civil rights organizations began drafting joint letters. Transportation unions debated how many of their members had spoken up and how many had been silenced. The Department of Transportation issued a statement that same night saying they were reviewing current accountability structures. But Marcus knew review wasn't enough. That night, he returned to his hotel room and looked over his notes. Angela Thompson had testified earlier in the day at a separate event. Her voice, once unsure, now rang like steel through the marble rotunda. She'd held up her framed boarding pass and said, This isn't just a ticket. This is the proof I wasn't supposed to exist in that seat." More stories followed. A Sikh man denied boarding. A Latino father split from his children at check-in. A Muslim woman asked to remove her scarf mid-flight. The pattern grew until it became impossible to unsee, and with every story, Marcus's case grew stronger. He wasn't just applying pressure, he was shifting the center of gravity. Behind closed doors, airline lobbyists scrambled. They offered pledges, pled for time, whispered to sympathetic lawmakers that the system didn't need disruption, it needed adjustment. But Marcus wasn't asking. He was building something new. The following morning, he met privately with the Secretary of Transportation. The secretary had come prepared, or thought he had. Marcus placed the same folder on his desk, same documents, same data. But this time, a final page had been added. A proposed National Passenger Equity Act, already drafted with input from legal experts and civil rights advocates. It was bold, it was sharp, and it made one thing clear. The age of silent bias in the skies was coming to an end. The secretary didn't speak for a full minute after reading it. Marcus stood, shook his hand, and walked out into the sunlight. His phone buzzed again. Another message, another voice. This time from a flight attendant at a competing airline. She simply wrote, "We're watching. We're ready. Tell us, what's next?" And Marcus, standing in the shadow of the Capitol dome, smiled. Because the fight had never been about one company. Now, it was about the air itself, and who had the right to breathe it freely at 30,000 feet. At first, the airlines tried to wait him out. It was the oldest trick in the corporate playbook. Ride the news cycle. Stay quiet. Offer just enough change to appear responsive. Assume the public would move on like they always do. Another controversy. Another headline, another forgotten promise. But Marcus James didn't blink. And this time, the public didn't move on. In the weeks following his testimony in Washington, Marcus became a fixture on every screen that mattered. Not because he wanted attention, because he had earned trust. Because he spoke in the voice people recognized as the one they wished they'd had when they were humiliated, profiled, spoken down to, or ignored. Airports were full of those people. Boarding lines, security checks, check-in counters, people who had been told they didn't belong in places they paid to be. Every network called for interviews. Most were declined. Marcus wasn't chasing airtime. He was building pressure. He assembled a coalition, not just activists and lawyers, but employees, pilots, baggage handlers, crew, people who had been trained into silence, some for years. People who knew the culture wasn't broken. It had been designed that way. Inside Atlantic Airways, executives tried to spin a narrative that it was all being handled, that reforms were underway, that the Marcus James situation was in progress. But passengers kept uploading clips, crews kept leaking internal emails, and every time the airline tried to reset the conversation, another story came out. One involved a black teenager denied boarding after a gate agent claimed his ID looked fake. Another involved a native woman who was removed mid-flight because she refused to answer questions clearly. Neither had media attention until now. Now, every injustice found a signal. Marcus didn't speak over these stories, he amplified them. On his platform, each voice mattered, not as props, not as background, as evidence. He published a report naming 12 specific cases across 5 major carriers, all with the same pattern: vague suspicion, biased escalation, corporate silence. Then, quietly, he began holding town halls. Not televised debates, not boardroom theatrics, just folding chairs, bottled water, open mics. In Atlanta, in Newark, in Chicago, airline workers came, off-duty and out of uniform. Some wore masks, afraid to be recognized. But they spoke. They spoke of quotas for upgrades, of unspoken profiling rules, of passengers who were labeled difficult simply for asking questions. And Marcus listened. He didn't interrupt. He wrote everything down. Reporters said he was building a case, but those who attended knew better. He was building a movement. Meanwhile, Atlantic's leadership grew restless. Some board members whispered about a buyout. Others suggested forcing Marcus to divest, a legal long shot, but a desperate one. Vance, still clinging to power, argued that the airline couldn't bow to what he called social media governance. But Marcus didn't need to govern. He just needed to show the public who already was. A shift began, subtle at first. Travel blogs started comparing diversity scores between carriers. Loyalty program members began demanding accountability. One major brand pulled a multi-million-dollar sponsorship from Atlantic, citing misalignment with corporate values. Employees began sending anonymous letters, not to whistleblow, but to thank him. Then came the invitation. A summit, global, televised, hosted by the International Aviation Standards Council. CEOs from across the industry, regulators, lawmakers, and Marcus James. They wanted him on the panel. Some said it was a trap, that they would try to paint him as divisive, radical, unreasonable. But Marcus had faced worse with no cameras rolling. Now, the lights were already on. He accepted. Before the summit, he gave no speech, no interview, just one line posted to his team's public page. "I'm not here to destroy airlines. I'm here to rebuild what they promised us in the first place." And that single sentence was quoted in headlines around the world. In the halls of Atlantic, silence hardened into resignation. Marcus had outlasted the outrage window. He had made the story too human to bury, too specific to deny. He had taken everything they tried to twist and held it up to the light, steady as a compass. And yet, even with all the power shifting in his favor, he hadn't delivered the final blow. Because Marcus knew what the industry didn't. This wasn't about how loud the story was. It was about how long it would echo. They gave him the smallest seat on the stage. At the International Aviation Standards Council Summit, under the glow of chandeliers and screens looping industry highlight reels, Marcus James sat at the far edge of a curved panel lined with polished executives. CEO name tags gleamed beside bottled water and pre-approved talking points. He wore no lapel pin, brought no binder, made no small talk. When he arrived, most of the room didn't look at him. The ones who did expected anger, disruption, drama. What they got instead was stillness. The moderator opened with a familiar question. What does accountability look like for an industry facing allegations of systemic bias? The CEOs responded in a practiced rhythm, acknowledgments of unintended harm, affirmations of ongoing dialogue, commitments to revisit procedures. Their voices were smooth. Their faces said nothing. Marcus waited until the room grew tired of the theater. Then he spoke. Not loud, not fast, just clear. "I'm not here to accuse anyone. I'm here to confirm what you already know." The air shifted. He told them about the flight, yes, but he didn't dwell on it. He didn't need to. He told them about the woman who had flown twice a week for 5 years without once being offered water in business class. About the man whose name was mispronounced every time it was read aloud, until he stopped correcting them. About a Muslim woman who was asked if her headscarf could be removed for comfort, not hers, but someone else's. He spoke with no notes, because every word was lived. The moderator asked what changes he was demanding. Marcus leaned back slightly and said, "I'm not here to demand anything. I'm here to expose who resists." For a moment, no one knew what to say. So Marcus filled the silence with truth. He said bias wasn't something that leaked through cracks in the system. Bias was the system. The way training manuals used phrases like passenger attitude. The way gate agents were told to trust their instincts, but only certain instincts were rewarded. The way escalation became instinctive when someone in 2A didn't match the crew's picture of who belonged. One CEO tried to deflect, talking about individual incidents, isolated patterns. Marcus didn't flinch. "I'm not the pattern," he said. "I'm the proof." A few rows back, someone from the Department of Transportation began writing. Marcus then explained what accountability actually looked like. Not apology, not committee, change. Change measured in who got promoted, in who reviewed complaints, in who had the power to override a profile-driven escalation and how often they used it. He spoke of transparency that didn't just appear in reports, but in culture. He spoke of hiring practices that didn't pad optics but shifted control. And when they asked how soon such changes could be implemented, he smiled for the first time. It took less than 60 seconds for a crew to decide I didn't belong. I think 60 days is plenty of time to reverse that decision at scale. There were no rebuttals, no applause, just a pause. And in that pause, the industry felt something it hadn't in years: exposure they couldn't spin. When the panel ended, press gathered around Marcus like metal to a magnet. Reporters asked if he believed the industry would follow through. He answered without looking at them. They won't do it because they want to. They'll do it because we're watching now. Later that night, as summit highlights played on news networks around the world, a different kind of highlight surfaced. A silent clip of Marcus standing up from his seat, walking past every CEO, and nodding once to Angela Thompson, seated in the front row. She stood too. And as the crowd began to disperse, one thing became clear. The summit hadn't resolved anything. It had revealed everything. Because Marcus hadn't come for closure. He had come for alignment, to bring the conversation back to truth, and let everyone see who still flinched when it arrived. And somewhere in a boardroom that night, someone finally asked the question Marcus had been waiting for since the beginning. What happens if we don't change? And the silence that followed? That was the answer. It didn't happen with a bang. It happened in the silence. One morning, the Atlantic Airways website quietly changed. The leadership team page, once lined with polished headshots and corporate bios, now had 3 empty spaces. No statement, no headline. Just blank white gaps where power used to sit. People noticed immediately. Screenshots spread. Questions flew. The airline offered no comment. Not at first, but it didn't need to. Everyone already understood. The board had started cutting its losses. The crew from Flight 447 had already been suspended pending review, but now it went deeper. Human resources directors, regional compliance leads, even one executive who had signed off on the vague training modules Marcus had exposed during his testimony in D.C. They were vanishing from the ranks. Not all at once, piece by piece, like a building being disassembled from the inside. Still, Marcus said nothing publicly. He made no announcement, gave no interviews. He didn't gloat, didn't post a single word, because this wasn't the moment for celebration. This was the moment for vigilance. Power, after all, doesn't surrender. It reorganizes. He watched carefully as the airline began floating new press releases filled with terms like values realignment and operational reset. But none of that meant anything if the culture stayed intact. So Marcus kept doing what he had from the beginning, listening. That was how he found Sarah Mitchell. She reached out through a mutual contact, a quiet message written late at night. She said she was a former flight attendant. Said she'd left the industry 2 years earlier, but she still hadn't shaken what she'd seen. She didn't ask for attention. She just wanted to speak plainly. Marcus agreed to meet. They sat at a small table in a corner cafe. No cameras, no staff. Just 2 people who had once flown under the same sky in opposite roles. Sarah told him about the early days of training, how crew were told to trust their instincts, how passenger behavior was always code for appearance, how it was understood, without ever being said directly, that some passengers needed to be checked twice if they didn't fit the image of who belonged in business class or first. She didn't justify it. She confessed it. She cried when she described her own moments of silence, her own complicity. Marcus didn't interrupt. He didn't offer quick forgiveness. He simply listened. When she finished, she said one more thing. "I want to help fix what I was part of." And Marcus nodded. The next week, Atlantic began rolling out the first round of revised crew training, not internal videos, not generic HR slides, but live, hands-on modules designed in collaboration with Marcus's team. Sarah helped shape the curriculum. So did Angela Thompson. They weren't faces of a campaign. They were architects of accountability. Across airport terminals, a quiet shift began. Crew briefings got longer. Supervisors held eye contact a little longer when giving instructions. Gate agents took more time before flagging passengers. It wasn't a revolution, not yet, but it was the sound of a machine slowing down, relearning. And then came the final crack. A memo leaked. It was from Douglas Vance himself, Atlantic's CEO, circulated to a handful of internal executives. In it, he dismissed the reform process as optics fatigue, called Marcus a prolonged distraction, and argued that public perception will drift elsewhere by Q2. The memo hit the press like a flare. Investors recoiled, employees raged, customers, already watching, began canceling flights. And inside the boardroom, the last defenders of Vance ran out of room. The vote came swiftly, unanimous. Douglas Vance was out. The very man who had once tried to have Marcus removed from a seat he rightfully owned was now removed from the seat he had clung to, the top of a company crumbling under the weight of the truth. That night, Marcus received a call. It was brief. A single sentence. "The board would like your input on interim leadership." He paused. Not because he was surprised, but because, in that moment, everything that had once been denied, his presence, his seat, his voice, had been invited in. Not as a guest. As a partner. Angela called a few minutes later. Her voice was steady this time. No tremor, no fear. "They finally understand who they were dealing with," she said. Marcus looked out at the city lights, the hum of jets still faint in the distance. "No," he said quietly. "They understand who we've always been." This wasn't a happy ending. This wasn't the end at all. This was the sound of something old breaking open, so something honest could begin. 2 years later, the podium stood beneath warm lights and heavy silence. The auditorium at the National Civil Rights Museum was packed. Journalists, scholars, students, crew members in uniform, and survivors of 1,000 unseen injustices. And in the front row, surrounded by people who once watched his story unfold on phones and train station TVs, sat Angela Thompson, hands folded in her lap. Her son beside her, taller now, dressed in a pressed white button-up that almost matched the one Marcus James wore when he walked on stage. He didn't arrive with a prepared speech. He never did. He stood still for a moment, scanning the room. And then, with no theatrics, just voice, clear and grounded, he began. "I didn't ask for this story," he said, "but I answered it." The room listened, not because they were waiting for a punchline, but because they already knew the weight of every word. They had followed it from a boarding gate in Los Angeles to the floor of the Senate to boardrooms and training sessions and policy shifts that stretched across airlines, agencies, even international carriers. Marcus hadn't just confronted bias. He had mapped it, named it, rewired the space around it. And now, he wasn't just speaking about what happened on Flight 447. He was speaking about the aftermath. What happens when the video fades, when the headlines rotate, when silence tries to creep back in. He spoke of Sarah Mitchell, now a lead advisor in crew ethics training, whose name once lived in the shadows of regret and now stood in every new employee handbook. He spoke of Angela, who had gone from a sobbing mother in a viral clip to a policy consultant working with 2 major airlines, ensuring no parent would be separated from their child because of someone else's fear. He spoke of the hundreds of people who had come forward, some publicly, some anonymously, each of them holding a piece of the story he had once thought was his alone. And then he said the sentence that finally quieted even the thoughts in the room. "You don't change the system by demanding a seat at the table. You change it by remembering the moment they tried to take your seat away and refusing to move." There was no applause, not at first, just stillness, a silence full of knowing. Then, slowly, the entire audience rose, not for show, not out of habit, but because they had witnessed something rare, a man who had turned personal insult into structural change, who had chosen clarity over vengeance, who had held the mirror high long enough for the whole world to finally stop looking away. Back at Atlantic Airways, the changes Marcus pushed for were no longer initiatives. They were policy, mandatory de-escalation protocol, transparent reporting, quarterly diversity audits. The industry didn't just adapt, it was forced to evolve. And no one had forgotten why. That night, as the event ended and the museum lights dimmed, a flight attendant in full uniform approached Marcus at the exit. She looked young, but her eyes carried the exhaustion of years. She didn't speak right away, she just handed him something. A printed photo. It showed a cabin, newly built, a training model. Inside it, Seat 2A had been redesigned, not for luxury, but as a classroom, And above it, on a mounted plaque, were 5 words. This is where it changed. Marcus stared at it for a long moment. He didn't frame it. He didn't post it. He just folded it once, carefully, and slid it into his jacket. Because he knew the truth. The story never really ended. It just kept flying forward. If that moment gave you chills, share this story, because silence never changes anything, but truth always does.